Russia's air defense network is not just failing, it is collapsing in real time, not metaphorically, literally. And what you are witnessing right now is the moment when a $500 billion military apparatus realized it has no answer to a $5,000 piece of engineering. Let that sink in for a moment. The most expensive, most layered, most extensively deployed air defense system in the world, the system that was supposed to turn Ukrainian skies into a no-fly zone, is being systematically dismantled by aircraft that cost less than a used car. This is not a story about one drone attack. This is a story about the collapse of an entire strategic assumption that Putin's military was built upon. What happened over the last 72 hours is going to echo through military doctrine for a generation. But first, you need to understand what was supposed to happen instead. 6 months ago, military analysts across NATO were making a fundamentally confident prediction. They said Russia's air defense architecture was too deep, too layered, too redundant for Ukraine to overcome. S-400s in the rear, Pantsirs protecting the front, short-range systems blanketing every critical target. Multiple redundancy at every level. The logic sounded airtight. You stack enough systems, you create enough layered coverage, and even a desperate attacker with inferior aerospace capacity will eventually bleed dry. That analysis was not wrong in isolation. It was wrong in its core assumption about how modern warfare actually works when one side is desperate and the other is certain. Here's the foundational error that Moscow made. Russia assumed that air defense is a static problem. You build a wall, you maintain the wall protects you. Defensive stability, strategic breathing room, time to consolidate. But Ukraine understood something that Russia's doctrine writers apparently missed. Air defense in modern asymmetric conflict is not a wall. It is a reaction mechanism. And once you understand your enemy's reaction speed, you can design your attack to exceed it. That is the hidden variable, not better missiles, not more resources, faster adaptation cycles than your opponent can match. Now pull the lens back for a moment. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because the real story here is not about drones. It is about why Russia's entire air defense philosophy has been hollowed out by a force that supposedly should not be able to operate in the air at all. In the opening 18 months of this war, Russia's air defense system shot down aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles at rates that looked defensible. 80% intercept rates on some threat categories, occasionally 90%. The kills were real. The system was working. But here is what Russia's planners failed to calculate. They were optimizing for volume and raw kill count. They were not optimizing for saturation, for coordinated swarms, for attacks designed specifically to overwhelm response timing. Ukraine watched this. Ukraine took notes. And then Ukraine did something that transformed the entire battlefield calculus. They stopped attacking with single weapons. They stopped thinking in terms of individual strikes. Instead, they began orchestrating attacks with a new logic, send so many targets at once in so many vectors simultaneously that the engagement process itself breaks down. Not because individual shots fail, but because the system cannot make decisions fast enough to prosecute all threats. Think about what that means operationally. An S-400 operator sees 30 targets inbound. The system has capacity for, let us say, 8 engagements. That operator has roughly 90 seconds to decide which 8 threats are the highest priority. But here is where the doctrine fails. Ukraine did not design these attacks to be responded to rationally. They designed them to be responded to in panic. And panic-driven air defense is ineffective air defense. The $5,000 drone, what military analysts call loitering munitions or kamikaze drones, became the perfect saturation weapon precisely because it is cheap enough to lose. A Patriot missile costs $1.6 million. An S-400 interceptor costs somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on configuration. But a modified commercial drone with an explosives package costs between $3,000 and $8,000 in materials and labor. You can lose 20 of them for the cost of a single interception shot. That is not a tactical asymmetry. That is an inversion of the entire cost-exchange ratio that air defense doctrine was built upon. And it gets even more serious from here. Over the last 4 weeks, there were 17 separate Ukrainian coordinated drone attacks on Russian rear area targets. 17? Not isolated incidents. not desperate harassment. Coordinated, planned, sequential attacks designed with increasing sophistication to find gaps in the air defense architecture. With each attack, Ukraine was learning. With each engagement, they were mapping the defensive response patterns. And with each iteration, they were tightening the noose. Here is the precise timeline of how this unfolded. And this is where you begin to see the strategic doctrine at work. Week 1, Ukraine conducted 3 coordinated attacks using between 30 and 50 drones per vector, approaching from different altitudes and different headings. 2 key findings. First, Russia's early warning radar system has a blind zone at extremely low altitude in certain geographic corridors. Second, once drones get within 10 kilometers of a target, the reaction time for an integrated air defense system to shift fire and engage becomes dangerously compressed. Week 2, Ukraine escalated to larger packages and somewhere in the range of 80 to 120 aircraft per attack. But they changed the attack profile. Instead of concentrated vectors, they dispersed across multiple approach lanes. The operational effect was immediate. Russian air defense operators reported coordination breakdowns between sectors. Units that were supposed to hand off tracking between systems began losing targets in the transition. 3 critical facilities were struck. 23 air defense systems reported degraded operational status. Week 3, Ukraine shifted doctrine again. They introduced decoy drones, essentially cheap cardboard and plastic aircraft with minimal signature, mixed among the real strike aircraft. The cognitive load on defensive operators spiked. System responsiveness dropped. They began allocating expensive interceptors against targets that were not actually threats. 8 engaged decoys. 2 real weapons impacted before engagement solutions could be generated. This is not accidental. This is deliberate exploitation of a fundamental vulnerability in how modern air defense systems process threat data. The real question is, why did Russia not see this coming? The answer lies in a doctrine frozen in time. Russian air defense theory was written in an era when your attacker was roughly your technological equal, a fighter aircraft from a peer competitor, a cruise missile from a sophisticated adversary. In that threat model, you needed expensive, powerful interceptors because you were engaged in a fair fight. The system was designed for symmetry, but Ukraine was not offering symmetry. Ukraine was offering something far more dangerous: cheap, distributed, abundant targets that forced an economic war of attrition that Russia could not win. Here's the mathematics of it laid bare. A modern integrated air defense system, let us use the S-400 as the model, costs between $500 million and $800 million for a complete battery. It requires roughly 30 trained personnel to operate. It needs constant maintenance, radar power, command integration, logistics support. The whole apparatus exists in a web of interdependencies. You lose the radar, the missiles are essentially useless. You lose the command post, coordination collapses. You damage the power generation, the entire system goes dark. That entire structure was designed to defend against symmetrical threats. The marginal cost to defend against one additional cruise missile is high but manageable. You fire one interceptor. That is your response. But what happens when your attacker sends 120 drones? The mathematics invert entirely. Russia cannot generate 120 defensive shots because they do not have 120 available interceptors in position. Even if they did, the cost exchange is catastrophic. 120 shots, assuming they are using the most expensive available systems, costs somewhere in the range of $100 to $150 million. The damage inflicted by even 30 of those drones getting through costs, in this case, roughly $300 to $600 million in destroyed facilities and strategic assets. Russia is losing the attrition war at the strategic level because they are fighting it with a defensive doctrine written for a different kind of opponent. And here's the part that changes the entire calculus of the war. Over the last 72 hours alone, Ukraine coordinated what analysts are calling the largest drone saturation attack of the conflict. The numbers are still being verified, but preliminary reports suggest between 240 and 300 drone aircraft were launched in a coordinated operation spanning 4 separate attack vectors over roughly 6 hours. The targets were 6 integrated air defense nodes positioned in a crescent across Russia's western rear area. What happened next revealed something that Russia's military planners have apparently been hoping to keep hidden. Their air defense network has a fatal integration flaw. The systems themselves, the individual S-400 batteries, the Pantsir platforms, the Tor systems, they work reasonably well in isolation. But when you attack the network as a system, when you exploit the coordination layer between different asset types, the whole apparatus becomes fragile. One of the 6 engagement zones broke down entirely. Air defense operators could not get firing solutions because their command integration system went offline. Whether that was from damage or electronic disruption remains unclear, but the operational effect was absolute. 43 drones struck targets in that zone without interception. The other 5 zones held better but deteriorated rapidly. As drones penetrated the outer layers of defense, they escaped the envelope of effectiveness for the longer range systems. By the time they reached the medium range and close-in defenders, saturation had already been achieved. Interception rates collapsed from the historical 80 to 90% range down to somewhere in the vicinity of 37 to 42%. Let me be specific about what that number means. That is not a tactical failure. That is a doctrinal collapse. An air defense network operating at 40% interception rate against a distributed drone attack is not a defense. It is a speed bump. It is barely a meaningful obstacle. And the strategic implications are enormous. Pull the lens back now. The real question is, what does this mean for Russia's entire approach to this war? Russia built its entire military strategy around air dominance, not air superiority in the tactical sense. They never really achieved that, but air denial. The belief that they could prevent Ukraine from conducting significant aerial operations and maintain sanctuary in rear areas where logistics, command, and industrial capacity could operate relatively protected. That entire strategic framework has now been disproven in real time. Ukraine has just demonstrated that it can strike anywhere in Russia with minimal cost and maximum effect. That changes everything about how this conflict will unfold from this point forward. It means Russian rear area infrastructure is no longer strategically safe. It means air defense, despite costing $500 billion rubles in deployment and maintenance, is no longer providing the protection Russia believed it would provide. For 18 months, Russia was operating under the assumption that they could absorb losses in manpower and equipment at the front while maintaining a protected rear. Industrial capacity could keep feeding the front. Oil refineries could keep supplying fuel. Command nodes could operate in relative security. Supply depots could stockpile ammunition without constant threat of disruption. That entire model is now exposed as fundamentally compromised. The last 48 hours have seen 3 separate refineries struck by coordinated drone operations. 2 major command facilities damaged. Ammunition storage facilities confirmed destroyed. This is not random strikes. This is a systematic campaign to collapse Russia's logistical capacity using a weapon system that costs 1% of what Russia budgeted for air defense. And here's what makes this truly devastating at the strategic level. Russia cannot easily fix this problem. The solution to saturation attacks is not to buy more missiles. The solution is to buy more systems, deploy them more widely, and increase the decision-making speed of your air defense network. But all of that takes time that Russia does not have. You cannot manufacture and deploy a new S-400 battery in 6 weeks. You cannot retrain personnel in integrated air defense operations in a month. You cannot rewrite doctrine and change command procedures in 72 hours. What Russia can do is try to surge production of short-range air defense systems and accept that their rear areas will be less protected. What they can do is disperse their critical infrastructure more widely and accept that that costs them efficiency and operational speed. What they can do is invest in electronic warfare and accept that that diverts resources from the front lines. Every solution available to Russia involves significant strategic cost. Every option means accepting something they have been unwilling to accept, that their rear area is no longer safe, and that maintaining acceptable losses at the front becomes impossible when your logistics network is under constant attack. The doctrinal implication is stark. Air defense, as Russia understood it, as a strategic shield permitting concentrated offensive operations, is dead. It is not damaged. It is not compromised. It is dead. And that death changes the basic force architecture that Putin's military was designed around. Now, the broader lesson here, what you are witnessing is not unique to Ukraine. This is a case study in how asymmetric adversaries exploit structural vulnerabilities in expensive, centralized defensive architecture using cheap, abundant, distributed offense. This is the future of military competition for the next decade. An adversary that costs 10 times less to deploy, that can operate in swarms that exceed your decision-making speed, that is designed specifically to overwhelm rather than outfight, that adversary operates under an entirely different strategic logic than the one your defensive doctrine was built to counter. Russia assumed air defense would be a constant, a solved problem, something you pay for once, deploy carefully, and then rely on for strategic protection. Ukraine proved that assumption wrong. They proved that if you understand the failure modes of a system, you can design an attack specifically to amplify those failure modes until the system breaks. That is the pattern. That is the lesson. That is what will be studied in war colleges for the next 20 years. Let me walk you through the technical details of how they did this, because the engineering tells you something crucial about where military innovation is actually happening. The drones Ukraine is using are not high-tech. They are modified commercial airframes, quadcopters in most cases, fitted with cameras, GPS navigation, and an explosives package. Cost to manufacture is somewhere in the range of $3,000 to $8,000 per unit, but the real innovation is not in the drone. The real innovation is in the swarm coordination and attack planning. Ukraine has been working with a distributed targeting network that allows real-time communication between drone operators, forward observers, and command authority. When one drone is shot down, the next one knows about it instantly. When one drone finds a gap in coverage, that information propagates to the others. When one drone attracts air defense attention, other drones exploit the fact that defensive assets are temporarily committed. This is not science fiction. This is already happening, and Russia's air defense network was not built to handle it. The systems that Russia deployed were optimized for individual engagement. Radar finds target, system generates firing solution, missile fires, one at a time. This works when you are defending against fighters or cruise missiles coming from one direction. It catastrophically fails when you're facing 200 drones coming from 4 directions using tactics designed specifically to overwhelm that sequential engagement process. Here's the precise mechanism of how it breaks down. A drone swarm approaches. Early warning radar detects them at roughly 100 kilometers. Air defense commanders begin assigning engagement priority, but here is where the vulnerability emerges. The time it takes to hand off targeting information between different system types, from the long-range S-400 to the medium-range Pantsir to the short-range Tor, that handoff time is built into the system. It is a coordination overhead that makes sense when you have time, but when you have 200 inbound targets and roughly 400 seconds before they begin impacting facilities, coordination overhead becomes a strategic liability. Command authority begins making decision errors. Systems begin shooting at targets that are not genuine threats. Engagement prioritization breaks down because there is no algorithm fast enough to compute the optimal engagement sequence for 200 simultaneous threats. The network does not fail because individual components are weak. The network fails because the network itself, the integration layer, was designed for a different threat environment. And it gets even more serious from here because the implications extend far beyond Ukraine. What Ukraine has just demonstrated is that the entire approach to air defense that has dominated military thinking for the last 30 years is approaching obsolescence. Centralized, hierarchical, expensive air defense systems built for peer-to-peer warfare with other industrial militaries are vulnerable to attacks using cheap, abundant, distributed, swarm-coordinated weapons. This is not a temporary problem that can be solved with incremental improvements. This is a fundamental architectural vulnerability. Every air defense system in the world, and I mean every system from the American Patriot to the European SAMP-T to the Russian S-400, every system is operating under a threat model that is now proven insufficient. The age of the strategic sanctuary enabled by air defense is ending. The next decade of military competition will be dominated by powers that figure out how to either defend against swarm attacks or build their strategy around the assumption that rear areas will be penetrated. Russia is trapped. Their doctrine assumes rear area security. Their logistics network is designed around that assumption. Their entire force structure is built on the premise that they can maintain concentrated offensive capacity in the front lines while their rear areas remain protected. That premise has been disproven. Now, the verdict, let me be absolutely clear about what is happening here. Russia's military has been exposed as doctrinally obsolete, not tactically outmatched, not temporarily disadvantaged, doctrinally obsolete. The assumptions that underpin their military architecture have been systematically dismantled by an adversary using cheaper, simpler, more adaptive technology. This is not about the drones themselves. Drones are just the mechanism. This is about Ukraine understanding something fundamental that Russia failed to understand, that in modern asymmetric conflict, speed of adaptation matters more than depth of resources. Ukraine adapted faster. Ukraine learned quicker. Ukraine designed attack systems faster than Russia could design defensive responses, and that is precisely what produces the strategic outcomes you are seeing right now. Not victory in the traditional sense. This is something more profound. This is the systematic degradation of an opponent's ability to project power through infrastructure denial and forced resource allocation. Russia is now forced to choose between protecting rear areas, in which requires moving defensive assets away from the front, or accepting rear area penetration. Either choice is strategically damaging. Either choice degrades their overall military capacity. That is checkmate at the strategic level. And here's what happens next, because this is where the true implications emerge. We are entering a phase of this conflict where Ukraine's capacity to strike Russian rear areas is going to expand, not contract, expand. Why? Because every successful strike against air defense proves the concept again. Every drone that gets through demonstrates that the system is vulnerable. Every refined attack against Russia's air defense forces Ukraine's strategic planners to think bigger about where they can strike next. In the coming weeks, you are going to see Ukrainian strikes penetrate deeper into Russian territory. You are going to see more facilities struck. You are going to see more refined attack coordination. You are going to see a military adversary that understands it can now operate with relative impunity in rear areas that Russia believed were protected. And Russia's response is going to be constrained because the solutions available to them all involve significant strategic cost. Surge production of air defense, that takes months. Disperse critical infrastructure, that degrades efficiency. Withdraw from Ukraine, that is politically impossible for Putin. So Russia is trapped in a contradiction. They cannot defend their rear areas as effectively as they believe they could. They cannot quickly improve air defense without degrading their offensive capacity. They cannot accept undefended rear areas without accepting logistical collapse. That is the trap. That is what this 72-hour window revealed. The question that remains unresolved, and it is a question that will define the trajectory of this conflict for the next 6 months, is whether Russia can accelerate their adaptation cycle fast enough to reverse this vulnerability. Can they innovate on air defense faster than Ukraine can innovate on attacks? Can they bring new systems online faster than Ukraine can overwhelm them? History suggests the answer is no. But that answer is going to be written by what happens next. And what happens next is going to be determined by whether Ukraine can maintain the offensive momentum and whether Russia can adapt their doctrine to operate under the assumption that rear areas are no longer safe. That is where this war is heading. That is what this doctrinal collapse means at the strategic level. The sanctuary is gone. The protection is illusion. And the force that understands that most clearly is the force that will define the outcome. Stay with us, because the answers to those questions are going to reshape not just this conflict, but military doctrine for the next generation. What happens next genuinely does change everything.